In 38 years on this bench, I've seen things that would keep most people up at night. I've watched criminals lie straight to my face with a smile on their lips. I've watched powerful men strut into my courtroom, convinced their money and their title would shield them from consequence. I've seen mothers cry, fathers beg, and children pay for sins they never committed. But the morning James Whitfield walked through my courtroom doors, I felt something different, something I worked very hard to keep off this bench. Rage. Not the hot, reactive kind, the cold, controlled kind, the kind that settles in your chest and doesn't leave. James Whitfield was 72 years old, a retired man who had spent his entire life doing everything right. Quiet neighborhood, spotless record, not one violation in 72 years, not a parking ticket, not a warning, nothing. The kind of man who waves at every neighbor on his morning walk and goes to bed each night with a clear conscience. He was also a black man, and on the night of September 14th, that was the only fact that mattered to Officer Dale Mercer. It was 9 p.m. James was driving home through Elmwood Heights, a predominantly white upper-class neighborhood. He wasn't speeding, his lights worked, his registration was current. He hadn't done a single thing wrong. Mercer's patrol car pulled up behind him anyway. Lights on, siren off. Just lights, slow and deliberate, like a predator circling. James pulled over immediately, hands on the wheel, calm, cooperative. He'd lived in this country for 72 years. He knew exactly how this moment had to be handled. Mercer walked up to the window. James asked politely, "Officer, can I ask why I've been stopped?" Mercer didn't answer. Instead, he yanked the door open, grabbed James by the collar of his jacket, and dragged him out of his own car. A 72-year-old man pulled out of his vehicle on a public street. James kept his hands raised, kept his voice level. "Sir, I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything." What came out of Mercer's mouth next I won't repeat in full, but I'll tell you this much. Those weren't police commands. They weren't warnings. They were raw, deliberate slurs designed to strip a man down to nothing, to remind James exactly how Mercer saw him, not as a citizen, not as a human being, as something less. Then Mercer slapped him, open hand, hard across the face of a 72-year-old man whose only offense was driving home. James didn't fight back. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He absorbed it, because he knew, the way black men in this country have known for generations, that reacting could cost him his life. And as if the slap wasn't enough, Mercer reached for his holster. He drew his weapon, not in panic, not out of fear, but slowly, deliberately, like he wanted James to watch every inch of that barrel come out. He pressed it directly against James Whitfield's chest and said, "If you say one more word, you will not make it home tonight." A loaded gun against the chest of a 72-year-old man with his hands already in the air. James told me later that in that moment, he wasn't thinking about fighting or running. He was thinking about one person, his daughter, Diane. He thought, "I just need to stay alive. Whatever he wants, I just need to stay alive." So he said nothing, stood completely still, hands up, eyes forward, and he survived. But surviving that night was only the beginning, because what Mercer did next, what unfolded over the following days, was somehow worse. And when the full truth came out in my courtroom, even I wasn't ready for how deep it went. Mercer handcuffed James, threw him in the back of the patrol car, and drove him to the station. No charges, no citation, no explanation. Just a black man in handcuffs because a white officer decided that was where he belonged. James was booked and placed in a holding cell. He asked what he was being charged with. Silence. He asked to call his daughter. Silence. He asked for a supervisor. Nobody came. He sat in that cell for 72 hours, 3 full days, with no charges filed, no documentation, no phone call, no lawyer, no explanation, just silence and 4 walls. Here's what makes it even worse, and this came out during the investigation that followed. The desk sergeant on duty that night had flagged James's detention as irregular within the first 6 hours. He'd gone to Mercer and asked what the hold was for. Mercer told him to mind his business, that it was handled. The sergeant, aware of Mercer's reputation in that department, backed off and said nothing. That single moment of silence cost James Whitfield 2 more days of his life. Meanwhile, Diane was losing her mind. She called her father's phone over and over. Nothing. She drove to his house, empty. She called every local hospital, nothing. She even called the non-emergency line to file a missing persons report and was told her father was probably fine, to just wait 48 hours. 48 hours. Her 72-year-old father was sitting in a cell 3 miles away, and she was told to wait. On the 3rd day, without warning or explanation, a guard opened James's cell door and nodded toward the exit. That was it. No apology, no paperwork, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had even happened. Just, you can go now. James walked home in the same clothes he'd been arrested in, hadn't showered, hadn't slept, had barely eaten. He walked through his front door, sat down at the kitchen table, and didn't move. Diane found him there 2 hours later, still in his coat, staring at nothing. She sat across from him, took his hands, and asked, "Dad, what happened?" And James Whitfield, this quiet, dignified man who'd kept his composure for 72 years, told her everything. The stop, the slurs, the slap, the gun against his chest, the 3 days, the guard who nodded at the door like none of it mattered. By the time he finished, Diane was shaking. She filed the court case the very next morning. If you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe before we go any further. You won't want to miss where this story goes. Now here's where it takes its first unexpected turn. When I opened the initial case file, something jumped out immediately. Mercer's own incident report from that night described the stop as a routine welfare check on a disoriented elderly male. 0 use of force documented, 0 weapons drawn, 0 slurs. According to his own paperwork, he had simply checked on a confused elderly man and released him once he was deemed stable. He'd fabricated an entire alternate version of events in writing on official police documentation, and it had been stamped and approved by his supervising lieutenant without a single question asked. This wasn't a rogue officer having a bad night. This was a system, a deliberate, protected system that had been doing this for a long time. I thought I understood the scope of it. I was wrong. Because when my clerk pulled Mercer's full personnel file the morning of the hearing, the room went quiet. This was nowhere close to his first time. 7 civilian complaints in 9 years. 7. Every single one closed as insufficient evidence and quietly buried. Let me tell you what those complaints actually said. 2016, a black teenager named Marcus Webb alleged Mercer stopped him without cause, used racial slurs, and slammed his head against a patrol car hood. Insufficient evidence. Closed. 2020, a local business owner, Raymond Chu, alleged Mercer demanded monthly cash payments in exchange for police presence near his shop. When Chu refused, his shop was vandalized 3 times in 2 months, and Mercer never once responded to the calls. Insufficient evidence. Closed. 2019, 3 officers from Mercer's own precinct filed an internal complaint alleging he created a hostile environment specifically targeting officers of color with degrading comments and deliberate assignment manipulation. It was reviewed by the same lieutenant who later approved Mercer's falsified report on James. Insufficient evidence. Closed. 2021, a woman named Gloria Patterson reported that Mercer drew his weapon on her unarmed 19-year-old son during a noise complaint. No charges were ever filed against the son. The complaint against Mercer? You already know. Insufficient evidence. Closed. 7 complaints, 9 years, 0 consequences. The department hadn't failed to notice the pattern. They'd chosen to look past it. There's a real difference between the two. When I finished reading, I set the file down and looked out at my courtroom. Mercer sat at the defense table in full uniform, arms crossed, looking completely at ease, like a man who'd sat in rooms like this before and always walked out the same way he walked in. That confidence told me everything I needed to know. He'd never once been held accountable. He had no reason to believe today would be any different. He was about to find out otherwise. The gallery that morning was fuller than usual. Word had gotten around the courthouse before the hearing even started, one of the clerks told me later, that people from 3 other courtrooms had slipped in during their breaks just to watch. A local reporter sat near the back with a notepad, though at that point she had no idea how much bigger this story was about to get. Diane sat in the front row directly behind her father, close enough that James could feel her presence without turning around. She had taken the day off work without hesitation. She told me afterward that she hadn't slept the night before, that she'd sat up rehearsing in her head everything she wanted to say if she got the chance to speak. She never got that chance in the way she expected, but what happened that day gave her something else entirely. I want to describe James Whitfield for you the way I saw him that morning, because it matters. He wore a gray suit that looked pressed within an inch of its life, a suit I later learned he had owned for over 20 years and kept for church and funerals. His shoes were polished. His hands, when they weren't folded in his lap, rested calmly on his knees. He did not fidget. He did not look around the room nervously the way most people do when they're about to testify about the worst night of their life. He sat with the stillness of a man who had made peace with what he had to do, even if it terrified him. That stillness, I would learn, was not the absence of fear. It was fear that had been carried so long, it had turned into something closer to resolve. James took the stand first. He walked up slowly, settled into the chair, and began, clear, calm, with the precision of a man who's replayed something in his mind 1,000 times. The stop, the slurs, which he repeated aloud because I asked him to, because I wanted every word on the official record. The slap, the gun against his chest, the 3 days. When he reached the part about the gun, about standing there thinking he might never see Diane again, his voice dropped just slightly, just for a moment. Then he straightened his back, took a breath, and finished. In 38 years, I've heard a lot of testimony. That was some of the most dignified I've ever witnessed. Then it was Mercer's turn, and what happened next wasn't what anyone in that room expected. He didn't deny it, not exactly. He leaned forward, looked directly at James, the elderly man he terrorized, and said James had made a serious mistake bringing this to court, that he had friends in this department and in this city, that old men who caused trouble had a way of finding trouble coming back around to them. He threatened him in open court, in front of me, in front of cameras. The audacity was so complete, so total, that for a moment the entire room simply stopped. That was his mistake. The last one he'd ever make in a courtroom, because what happened in the next 10 minutes changed everything. And the look on Mercer's face when he finally understood what was coming is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Quick question for you. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. People tune in to this channel from all over the world at every hour. And honestly, at this point in the story, I completely understand why you can't look away. Keep going, it gets bigger. I've followed one rule on this bench for 38 years. I do not lose my composure, no matter what I hear, no matter what I see, no matter how much something turns my stomach. I stay measured, I stay in control, because the moment a judge loses control of herself, she loses control of the courtroom. And a courtroom without control isn't a courtroom anymore. It's just a room. But when Dale Mercer finished threatening James Whitfield in open court, I made a decision. I would not stay quiet about this. I told my clerk, loudly, on the record, to pull Officer Dale Mercer's complete personnel and disciplinary file and bring it to my bench immediately. His attorney started to object. I told him to sit down. He sat down. When the file arrived, I read from it out loud. Every complaint, every allegation, every name, Marcus Webb, Raymond Chu, Gloria Patterson's son, the 3 officers from his own precinct. I entered every single one into the official court record so none of it could ever be buried again. I watched Mercer's face while I read. The confidence didn't disappear right away. At first, he just looked annoyed, like this was a minor inconvenience, like he was still certain this would end the way everything else always had for him. Then I got to the internal complaint filed by his own colleagues, the ones who worked beside him and still found the courage to speak up. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. I kept reading. 7 complaints, 9 years. every one of them buried by the very system meant to hold him accountable. When I finished, I set the file down, looked directly at Mercer, and told him exactly what I thought, on the record, in front of the entire room. I told him that drawing a loaded weapon and pressing it against the chest of an unarmed 72-year-old man was not police work. It was not protection. It wasn't a judgment call made under pressure. It had a different name, one that had already been documented 7 times by 7 different people and ignored every single time. I told him threatening a witness in open court wasn't boldness, it was desperation. And desperate men with badges are the most dangerous kind because they've spent so long believing the rules don't apply to them that they've forgotten how to stop. I told him his silence was over. Then I delivered the verdict, guilty on every count. Unlawful detainment, filing a false official report, assault on a civilian, threatening a civilian with a deadly weapon, conduct unbecoming of an officer, witness intimidation in open court. 5 years in federal prison, a $10,000 fine, badge suspended immediately, full termination proceedings to follow, and his entire case file, every complaint, every buried allegation, every falsified report, personally referred by me to the FBI for a federal civil rights and corruption investigation. I added one more thing in writing, a recommendation that the FBI also investigate the supervising lieutenant who'd approved Mercer's falsified report and buried those 7 complaints. Mercer hadn't operated in a vacuum. Someone had shielded him repeatedly, deliberately, and that person needed to answer for it too. The courtroom went completely silent. Mercer's attorney had stopped writing entirely, just staring at the table. Even he understood there was nothing left to argue. But Mercer himself looked at me one more time, and then something happened that no one in that room was ready for. He didn't accept it. He rose slowly from his chair, and what he did in the next 30 seconds, in front of every camera, every witness, everyone in that room, was the most reckless thing I have seen in 4 decades on this bench. What happened in those 30 seconds sealed his fate for good. But before we get there, if this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed because you'll want to see this through to the end. When a man has spent his whole career believing he's untouchable, being told otherwise doesn't just anger him, it makes him dangerous. Mercer stood up slowly. His attorney grabbed his arm, told him to sit down. Mercer shook him off without even looking at him. His eyes were fixed on me, only me. The room went so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He took one step toward the bench. My bailiff, Officer Raymond Cole, former Army Ranger, 12 years working this courtroom, a man who's seen it all, was on his feet instantly, hand on his weapon, ordering Mercer to stop and sit down. Mercer stopped. He didn't sit. He reached into his jacket. I'll be honest with you, in that moment, time did something strange. It slowed down in a way I still can't fully explain. I used to think people exaggerated that feeling. They don't. Every detail sharpened, the sound of fabric, the movement of his hand, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. He pulled his personal weapon, a Glock 17 he was carrying off duty, and pointed it directly at me, sitting on the bench in my own courtroom. Cole had his weapon drawn and trained on Mercer in under 2 seconds. 2 more bailiffs came through the side door within 5. Someone in the gallery screamed. Chairs scraped, people scrambled, the room tore itself open into chaos. But I didn't move. I sat there with a loaded gun aimed at my face, and I did not move an inch. Hands flat on the desk, breathing steady. I looked Mercer dead in the eyes and said 2 words, "Put it down." Not a question, not a plea, a statement, calm, final. For what felt like an entire lifetime, probably no more than 8 seconds, Mercer stood frozen, arm raised, hand shaking, face flushed, every trace of arrogance gone, replaced by something uglier. The look of a man realizing in real time that the edge he'd been walking toward for 9 years was right here, right now, with no way back. Then his arm dropped. The gun hit the floor. Cole was on him before it stopped bouncing. Mercer was face down on the courtroom floor, cuffed in under 10 seconds. I counted. I needed to count. I needed something solid to hold on to. FBI agents who'd already been alerted arrived within 4 minutes. Special Agent Diana Reeves, lead on the federal investigation I'd already quietly triggered with my referral that morning, walked in, looked at Mercer on the ground, and didn't look surprised. She told me later that the moment she'd heard I'd referred his full file to the FBI, she had a feeling things might escalate, and she'd already stationed 2 agents outside as a precaution. That precaution saved lives. New charges were added on the spot: assault on a judicial officer with a deadly weapon, brandishing a firearm inside a federal courthouse, attempted intimidation of a judge. The list that was already long grew even longer. As they hauled Mercer to his feet to walk him out, he looked at me one final time, that same cold, deliberate stare, like even now he still believed this wasn't truly over. I held his gaze until Agent Reeves walked him through those doors and he was gone. The courtroom stayed silent for a long time after that. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I sat there, hands still flat on the desk, and I just breathed. Then I looked over at James Whitfield, and what I saw on his face after everything he'd endured caught me completely off guard. He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even relieved exactly. He was doing something I hadn't seen him do once since he walked into my courtroom. He was smiling. I called a recess right after they removed Mercer. In my chambers, alone at my desk, for the first time in 38 years on this bench, my hands were shaking. Not during, after. That's how adrenaline works. It leaves slowly, and reality rushes in to fill the space. A loaded gun had been pointed at my face, in my own courtroom, in the place I've spent my entire career trying to make represent safety, order, and justice. My clerk brought water. Officer Cole checked on me twice. I told them both I was fine. I wasn't entirely fine, but I was functional, and I had unfinished business. 10 minutes later, I walked back out. Diane sat beside James, arm around him. Both of them watched me take my seat. James had his hands folded in his lap, that same small, quiet smile still on his face, the kind of smile that costs something, the kind that only shows up after a very long wait. I looked at him and said, for the record, in front of everyone still in that room, that what he'd endured wasn't just an injustice, it was a deliberate, systematic abuse of power protected by institutional silence. He'd been stopped without cause, degraded with slurs, physically assaulted, threatened at gunpoint, and imprisoned for 3 days without charge. And the man responsible had spent 9 years running variations of the same pattern on other people while his department looked away. I told him his courage in coming forward, in taking that witness stand and repeating every ugly detail on the record, had done more than bring one man to justice. His testimony, combined with the case file I'd referred to the FBI, had opened a federal investigation reaching far beyond Dale Mercer, the lieutenant who buried those complaints, the culture inside that department that let men like Mercer believe they were untouchable, all of it now under federal scrutiny. James nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when words have stopped being necessary. Now here's the part of the story I never saw coming, the part I think about more than anything else that happened that day. 3 weeks after the hearing, Agent Reeves called me with an update. While combing through Mercer's financial records, they'd found irregular cash deposits going back 6 years, small enough to dodge automatic flags, consistent enough to form a clear pattern. They traced it to a network of 3 other officers in the same precinct running a coordinated bribery scheme. Businesses, traffic stops, evidence tampering, DUI cases, all connected. And the same lieutenant who'd buried 7 complaints against Mercer sat right at the center of it. 4 officers arrested, 1 lieutenant arrested, the precinct placed under federal oversight, all because a 72-year-old man refused to go home and stay silent about what had been done to him, all because his daughter walked into a courthouse and filed a case, all because one hearing in one courtroom pulled a single thread that unraveled something that had been rotting for years. Mercer received an additional 12 years on top of his original sentence for the courtroom assault and the federal corruption charges. He'll be in his 80s before he's even eligible for parole. His pension, gone. His certification, permanently revoked. His name, on a federal record that follows him for the rest of his life. The story didn't stay contained to my courtroom for long. That reporter sitting in the back row that morning filed her article by that same evening, and within 48 hours, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By the end of that week, camera crews were parked outside the courthouse every morning. I don't say that to make this about attention. I say it because the attention did something important. It meant the department could no longer treat this the way it had treated the 7 complaints before it. It meant insufficient evidence was no longer going to be an option anyone could quietly stamp on a folder and file away. The City Council held an emergency session 11 days after the hearing. I did not attend. It would not have been appropriate for me to weigh in publicly on matters that might still come before my bench, but I read the transcript afterward, the way I read most things connected to a case I've presided over. The police chief, a man who had held that position for 6 years, resigned before the session even concluded. He wasn't implicated in the bribery scheme directly, but the council made it clear that a department capable of burying 7 complaints against 1 officer over 9 years was not a department that could continue operating under the same leadership. An interim chief was appointed within the week, and a civilian oversight board, the first of its kind in that city's history, was established with actual subpoena power. Actual power, not the toothless kind that exists on paper and never gets used. Officers from that precinct began coming forward on their own after the arrests, not because they were compelled to, but because, as one of them told investigators, once it was clear the department could no longer punish people for speaking up, there was suddenly a lot more to say. 2 more internal complaints from years earlier resurfaced, complaints that had never even made it into an official file, just verbal reports that had been waved off in hallway conversations. Both were reopened. Both led to further disciplinary action against officers who had, in one way or another, helped maintain the culture that let Mercer operate the way he had for nearly a decade. Marcus Webb, the teenager from that 2016 complaint, he wasn't a teenager anymore by the time any of this became public. He was 26 years old, working as a mechanic, and when a local news crew tracked him down for comment, he said something I think about often. He said he had stopped believing anyone would ever look at that file again, that he had made peace with the idea that what happened to him simply wouldn't matter to anyone but himself. When he found out his name had been read aloud in open court, entered permanently into the record by a sitting judge, he said it was the first time in 9 years he felt like the system had actually seen him. That's not closure. Closure implies something finished, wrapped up neatly. This was something closer to acknowledgement, which is smaller but no less important. Diane called my clerk's office a few months later just to say thank you. She said James was sleeping better, that he'd started his morning walks again, that he waved at his neighbors the same as he always had. I think about James Whitfield often, about those 72 hours in that cell, about a gun pressed to his chest while his only thought was his daughter's face, about him sitting at that kitchen table in his coat, staring at nothing. And then I think about that smile, the one that finally appeared the moment Mercer was walked out of my courtroom in handcuffs. That smile is what justice looks like when it finally shows up. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, earned, and long overdue. I've spent 38 years on this bench, believing a courtroom should be the one place where everyone, regardless of color, wealth, or position, stands equal before the law. Cases like this remind me we're not there yet, that there are still Mercers out there wearing badges, convinced the uniform makes them untouchable. But there are also James Whitfields, people who survived the worst of it, hold their composure, and still trust that the truth, spoken clearly and placed in front of someone willing to listen, still carries weight. That trust isn't naive. It might be the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. If it moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think, if it reminded you why accountability actually matters, do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what this story made you feel. And share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like James Whitfield's deserve to be heard. Not buried, not marked insufficient. Heard. Justice is a choice. Every single day. Choose it.